Okay, I'm going to start out this by putting up my Patreon for those interested. They can see it in the chat. It's also in the bottom of the description as well. And just click on the link and it'll get you there. Gives a little bit of a description of everything with it. I'm on disability. It helps pay for cost for disability, stuff to help out with the podcast. For equipment as well, gives me some money to live on if you donate as well, stuff like that. It'll go into a little bit more with it. If you donate to the $50 a month, once we reach a threshold of a few people, that'll you'll be in for winning a Roman silver coin. If you go up to the $100 level, it'll be entered in the same threshold of a few people. You'll be entered in to win a Byzantine gold coin. Those are from those respective empires. I'm getting those from American Precious Metals Exchange, and because that's where I personally get my precious metals, and especially with the current dollar crisis, I would definitely go with buying stuff, because that's why we're seeing oil currently crash. Now on to this thing is, you're going to notice kind of a unique topic is Tyranny creates strange bedfellows to protect freedom. This is basically going to be about the Assange arrest, which is going to be kind of interesting for people. Now, what we're going to notice is that with this case is that the arrest of Julian Assange is finding really, really strange people coming together. And I would not have assumed it myself. If not, I would have seen it on Twitter as well as other social media sites. Now we're seeing that basically, obviously, your neoconservatives and your establishment Democrats are coming together, obviously, to protect the empire itself. Of the bureaucrats, they want to basically protect them and protect this bureaucratic state because they believe in it. But what's happening, which is on the other side, this is where we get kind of some unique things. Now, what I automatically expected was the more liberty-minded people were going to be automatically going to get behind him. This is an automatic people like me and more like-minded people like me were going to get behind him. Now, what I did not expect was for people on the left wing, like people that were from the Young Turks, to get behind him. Now, this had me agreeing with people from the Young Turks. Now, if you understand this channel, when it comes down to economic points, you would have seen me basically rip into them and then some. And you could pretty much go back on certain things when it comes to that. When it comes to things on the Green New Deal, you could basically pretty much go back to that, and I will be basically ripping the hell out of them. Basically tearing them up one side and down the other because they really want these deals to go through. And they're willing to actually go with unreasonable economic theories, and that are not even feasible, that don't even fit to actual history. And this is something which is, but yet on this one thing with it, we're finding that they come together. Now, that we actually come together on this issue. And we'll always find, the fact is that when we find basically is extreme polar opposites come together, you're always going to find the ideas of your neoconservatives say, oh, how dare you go together with them, and you're betraying your normal roots, and you're usually going to find them as well with it trying to stay like that. You'll have them especially going after people like Rand Paul, when Rand Paul tends to go go with a more pro-liberty stance, and he's willing to work with people from the other side, even people like Ilhan Omar, or working with people like this is even from the House of Representatives, working with people like Ilhan Omar or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And you'll have these neoconservatives that just basically go crazy over this. And it still goes in the same idea of what actually happens. They basically go, and they'll go nuts over this. They think every issue has to be a complete polarizing point. And regardless if it's actually that thing, they think that it needs to be polarizing. And that's not the case. And because most of the issues are actually not polarizing when it comes down to it. Because if a Democrat, like let's say Ilhan Omar, proposes something that the U.S. should not nuke the United States, are we going to have neoconservatives out there saying we want the United States nuked? No, because you would never have that even be proposed, because they know that they would be voted out of office immediately, and most likely it would cause people marching on Capitol Hill and hauling them out physically and removing them immediately if they even thought of such a thing. And that's why we find that you're not going to find them just basically automatically voting for polar opposites. And that's why in many issues you'll find you could find common ground with people of both sides. Now, what we're going to find with this Assange issue is that first we need to look at why this happened. Well, this happened basically most people are trying to look at trying to state that it had something to do with the Russiagate. Well, it has nothing to do with Russiagate. This has to do with the neocons making the policy. This is basically people like Mike Pence, people like John Bolton, and people like Mike Pompeo basically making pulling the strings, along with some neoconservative lawmakers pulling strings on this, along with some people on the Democratic side as well that wanted his head. And it's basically for the releases on the Iraq War, which pointed out, number one, stupidity on the Iraq War policy. Number two, it showed the war crimes during the Iraq War. Now, you can go through an actual war without committing war crimes, and this has actually been noted in the past. But the fact is when you do commit war crimes, they need to be noted and they need to be punished, so that when you do go through war, that you don't have that problem in the future. Now, what this problem has had is that we need to adjust for that. And this is the actual issue. And what we have here is that he actually released things such as the United States military shooting and killing two reporters from Reuters. They killed killed a 77-year-old woman from Iraq, as well as a 5-month-old baby. Now, what they did is they used an actual drone strike and bombed the area to essentially get rid of the people that they are actually killing, to actually cover up for the actual crimes they're doing. So you could not gather any evidence. But because they already had all the footage in which was taken and was put up on WikiLeaks, this was actually used for getting more transparency and showing what was actually happening, so people could actually get an accurate view instead of the propaganda that was happening on legacy news media. And this is, and so what they wanted, they basically used the excuse of, oh, he was jeopardizing the mission. Well, when we actually look at the whole thing, number one is nobody died because of any information released. This is actually a myth. There was actually a myth that people died because of information released. This is the myth that people died for information released was actually put out by the neoconservatives to actually extend the sentence of Bradley Manning, now called Chelsea Manning. And this is basically was actually a point to basically create this whole big thing to crack down on whistleblowers, especially going after war crimes. And it was to basically kind of give the Department of Defense kind of carte blanche to do whatever it wanted to in whatever regions it wanted to, and to essentially not showcase what was really happening. They dealt with being just as mad when the exact same thing happened under the Johnson administration with the Pentagon Papers, and when some of the information was released there. Now, even though they only released part of what was really going on, we actually found out some more stuff when people started to explain what really happened out there. Now, with Vietnam, we know that people were actually going out there shooting innocent civilians. They weren't just basically going out there and trying to deal with the mission. They were shooting innocent civilians out there, just killing villagers. They were also raping innocent women out there, and they're doing this basically because of because they felt that they could get away with it because the Pentagon was going to cover up for it, and they weren't going to release any of this information. And because things get out with it, then that's what happens. Now, these things are going to end up going on the records with it. So when some of these guys later in life committed crimes, well, guess what? These records were expunged. Were not expunged from what they were doing militarily overseas, and these things were brought up. And they were showing actually previous criminal acts while overseas at war. And we that even certain serial killers like Maurice Solomon, who was the Sacramento Slayer, was actually guilty of rape overseas while in Vietnam. We have I believe it was either cousin or uncle of Richard Ramirez, who was guilty of rape overseas as well. I'm not sure if it was actually homicide as well of Vietnamese prostitutes as well out there as while in Vietnam on top of that. And this is what happens, and what will happen is they will cover these facts up, and it's not until later that they end up that these facts get released when these individuals commit crimes here, and those facts have to be released to the court when they start making up other cases against them, when they start committing crimes here, such as when Richard Ramirez's I believe his cousin shot his wife right in front of Richard Ramirez, and that was right in the face, and killed her. And when we start to look at that, you will see that what this does is this actually starts to change things. Well, this is why we actually need some actual transparency. And when we get this transparency, this is what we would call journalism. Now, being a propaganda machine is not journalism. putting out propaganda is not what we call journalism. That's not an act of journalism at all. And doesn't matter with it what you want to call it. But it's never been journalism. It's basically all you're doing is becoming essentially a literary arm of the United States intelligence forces, or whatever country you're working for. And you're doing nothing more than that. What it takes is writing truth to power, and it doesn't matter if you're releasing primary sources such as WikiLeaks does, or if you're doing secondary sources and writing about these things and trying to get more information out to the public about it concerning these issues. And that's where it becomes very, very important, because when we're talking about this is very, very important, because and obviously when it comes down to those primary pieces with it, you're going to have bad intelligence of pieces that are given. These are the same pieces that are given to the officials as well. But these are very, very important pieces for people to have, especially historians. Now, the fact is most of the time the government wants to squash these and never allow these to see the light of day. But it's very, very important for people to see these, because when you're actually making an accurate depiction of what history really is, these pieces are very, very important to actually show what really goes on. Because you can get a better picture of what's really going on instead of what they want to actually portray. There's a difference between what we're getting from the media of government propaganda and what's really going on behind the scenes. And what that thing going on behind the scenes is the actual true history of what people need to be taught, what kids need to be taught in the history, in the future. They don't need to be taught about this government propaganda, because that's not the way kids need to be learning. They don't need to be learning about that garbage. Now, when we look at why things like this happen, now things like this happen is basically is pretty much because you have this is in a historical context, is that basically we're talking that the empire wants to protect itself. It doesn't matter in what historical context we're talking about, being a small country or being a large country. It basically, the establishment in the bureaucratic arm wants to protect itself. And they do not want to essentially relinquish its basically continued power, and they do not want to relinquish it to what would be constitutional. And this is the whole point. And this is why when something comes out like this, they essentially know that they want to punish those. And they want to essentially extend out and try to twist what is constitutional. And that's why what they'll do is they'll search for areas that are essentially have judges that are not viewing the Constitution in such a way that it was written, but rather are judges that are essentially just going to rubber stamp whatever the government wants. This is like the Eastern District of Virginia. This is what they're essentially going to do. This is why it's very, very important to do that, because what's going to happen is it's basically going to be a show trial. They know what's going to happen, and they know that basically what's going to occur is that it's basically going to be he's guilty and automatically guilty. Doesn't matter what evidence he produces, because they're going to state that they cannot have a jury because they're going to claim national security, which means that, so it's only going to be the judge, which is essentially they're denying him his actual rights, but they're going to state it's national security, so they can't have a jury. And what they're going to do is basically they're going to state that the prosecutor can pretty much go through and railroad him, and it's going to be the end of the case. It's going to be over in like a week, and that nobody can ever hear about this ever again. That they're never going to release any of the facts of the case because of that. And if that's why they specifically do not want Trump to intervene. Now, if we go what's happened in the past with these events with it is when you get governments that become this big, eventually this is kind of an act of what ends up occurring when they get desperate. And when they get desperate about wanting to maintain their power. We've seen this with a bunch of cases. We've seen this with King George III when he wanted to keep control over the United States, and he started to use where soldiers could write their own warrants. Basically, which led way to the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. We've seen it with the case of where Marcos Ferdinand Marcos, to avoid being removed from office from an actual vote, he ended up actually declaring martial law. Now, this is so that Benito Aquino Jr. did not win an election. His thugs also murdered Benito Aquino Jr. And this was basically because he knew he would have actually lost. Now, that's looking at the Philippines as well, and we need to understand that, and that's what ended up occurring with that situation. And we need to look at that as well, and these are some key situations in which happen when these people get desperate. And when the state gets very, very desperate, what they do is they try to go and attack certain individuals that they don't like. And this is what happens with this declining empire. And what ends up, and we need to look at what's going to happen, and it's basically, we also need to kind of look toward what ended up happening with the boiling point in 2015. Now, this boiling point in 2015 that was happening where people were kind of really mad with the bureaucracies here in the U.S., as well as the state of the monetary system, did not go away. It still has not gone away to this date. It's still sitting there because nothing has changed. The bureaucracy is still in charge, just as much, if not a little bit more, and the Federal Reserve is still sitting right there making all of these decisions. Well, guess what? If Trump is sitting around there doing nothing and saying, I don't know anything about this, and I'm not going to do anything about this, and I'm basically going to, not only am I not going to audit the Federal Reserve, I'm actually going to be interested in more quantitative easing. Well, he will essentially be considered to be enemy number one when it comes down to it, and people are going to essentially be turning their back on him very soon, and they're going to be really, really mad. Now, if we can get someone up there like a Tulsi Gabbard, this is going to be something very, very interesting, because he would not survive against her, because the fact is she's going to have the ability to kill him in a debate, because he's basically taking all of his talking points now from people like Ambassador John Bolton and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. These are people who have actually done their best to essentially they destroyed the midterm elections. These were the two people who did it. They destroyed the actual North Korean summit and a possibility of peace there. These are people who actually have hands-on in trying to dismantle the idea of what we have down there with Venezuela. You don't have to touch Venezuela. Don't put any sanctions on them. Leave them alone. This is also people who basically want more regime change in the Middle East with now Iran. And we've already seen what regime change has done in the Middle East. You've now had Sunni Islamic extremists running wild. And this is a major, major problem that we've actually had. And we need to realize this, and we need to go to a system toward not intervening. Now, Trump needs to actually take the bull by the horns and start telling these people, you're gone, you're out of here. Now, he has, as I pointed before, his whole cabinet is filled with people who have either given up trying and who are basically just starting to leave now. I expect Mick Mulvaney to leave very, very soon because Trump doesn't want to try anymore. And then with trying to work with liberty-based people. And then the rest of the people are neocons. These are people who actually fought against Trump being elected. Now this should be very, very key to what Trump needs to think about. Do you want to actually work with people who tried to prevent you from being elected? These were people who actually paid for the dossier at the start. And then when it comes down to it is we need to look at, so when we look at what was actually building up, the people that actually wanted him elected actually wanted him to start to dismantle these bureaucracies, not to enhance them, and not to put them in greater power of everything that we have in our lives. And that's exactly what he's done. Just because he's going to be going after the office of I forgot what it's called. It's OPM. Office of Personnel Management, just because he's going to, but he's really, all he's going to do is just break that down into 3 agencies. He's really not really killing anything, and that's only because of their inability to really handle things when it comes down to security. And he's not really doing anything. Nobody's really going to be removed. He's just splitting it up. He's not really killing an agency. He's just splitting it up. And what needs to be understood is he's not doing anything, and he's basically just expanding things out. And so when we look at these things, is he's basically, this boiling point is still there, and that's what needs to be understood. Is when we still have that boiling point sitting there, it needs to be understood that that's not going to go away. Now, obviously, you're going to have these people who are going to believe a lot of the legacy news media's points of Trump with it from the start, but the fact is they're not going to be going away. What he needs to understand is the fact is he needed to start attacking the bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy needed to actually be attacked from the start. And instead of basically worrying about things, if his attorney general didn't want to do anything, tell the attorney general, get lost, get someone in there that's liberty-based that's going to do something. When he saw Whitaker was going to be liberty-based, bring Whitaker directly in there. Do not bring Barr in there. Barr is completely ineffective, because Barr is basically going to be pro-bureaucracy. He was one of the people that was essentially on the team of one of the few guys who actually started the actual dossier. That's why Barr is actually keeping this idea, this myth, that Russia had something to do with the DNC server. Russia had nothing to do with them, because we know there was a direct download. there were no Russian people. This was basically because CrowdStrike had a hatred of Russia, and unless they actually did an actual direct investigation from the FBI or the Department of Justice, which they did not, they wouldn't have figured anything out. And since they failed to do this, we don't know anything about that, and that's what needs to be understood. And they need to actually they needed to do an investigation. Now it's too late because all of that material is gone. They could go to the NSA and get whatever type of data that they have there, and get whatever type of data came in and out. That could be about the best option, but that's still far from what actually was on there. That could give some type of a legitimate case to prove that nothing was there. They could also go to someone like Julian Assange and try to verify things with that as well. Assange is going to basically verify it never came from Russia, as he's verified before. He can verify his source as well. But when it comes to this, they basically want and when it comes down to this, we need to realize that what's actually going on is this is basically creating an option for what's happening with declining empires. And this is basically, it almost seems like a last-ditch effort. And what they're doing is they're basically making Assange out to be a martyr. And it's going to bring people, very, very unique people, together. Now, what's going to happen forward when it comes to the actual government is you tend to go toward more of a liberty-based government, because when you get big government people on board with that, they usually understand that they can have their own little societies within those liberty-based governments, and that they're usually free to have their own little societies within those systems, and they're free to have those societies separate within those systems, and that they're not going to be bothered. It just means that everybody lives free on their own, and that you're not going to force, but it's probably going to be what the end up option is with this, and it just ends up being that that's the end point, and it's going to change what happens with our defense as well. Pretty much, it means that there's probably going to be dissolving of it's pretty much going to be like a dissolving of what extra things which are not in the Constitution that are being done currently. And they're basically going to be pretty much cut right out. And that's pretty much going to be what the future is going to be. And everything else is going to be handled by local areas, and going back down to that. And people are going to be free with whatever type of society they dream of establishing. And people are going to be doing a lot of voting with their feet for the type of society that they want to live in, and it's going to be a lot different. And essentially, that's what if they want to make Julian Assange out to be a martyr for that, then essentially they're going to make Assange a lot bigger than he actually is, and it really. And there's probably going to be airports named after him and a lot of things like that. Well, if that's their goal, then they're going to basically, this is going to basically be what's the occurrence. And they're going to be doing something very, very stupid, because it's pretty much going to be globally where neoconservatism is going to die. People like Ben Shapiro are pretty much might as well take the trip to the top of the Empire State Building and jump. because his career is going to be over. His career of pushing neoconservatism is going to be over. All the people of that light with it, pretty much your careers are over, and it's done for. And because it's going to be over with it, they're pretty much you're not going to have anywhere in government, anywhere to go to push your agendas anymore, because it's going to cause a 180, because you're going to be viewed as pariahs in the actual country, and they're going to view you as criminals, every one of you. They're pretty much, after that, there's pretty much what's going to happen is you might even see people wanting to destroy any type of facilities that are linked with any of these war criminals. And if they even dare try to do anything to Assange. And that's pretty much what's probably going to come next. And because people are not going to tolerate any type of maltreatment. And I'm not saying I advocate for violence with it, but this is just what happens when you tend to push the people well beyond the breaking point. You need to understand 2015 was that breaking point. And people were fed up at that. Most of what the Tea Party and what the Tea Party movement was about was at the end level of the breaking point. That was it. And people need to understand that. People need to understand that was the end level. That was pretty much, you're skating on thin ice right there. And if you go any further, it's going to blow up in your face. 2015 basically brought it to the boiling point where it's basically boiling over. And now you've basically brought a point to where both sides are willing to essentially work together to essentially go right back at you. And this is what's going to happen. And essentially you're going to basically be, it doesn't matter who you think you are, whether you're not going to be controlling people anymore. And you're not going to find these big controlling interests out there any longer. And it's pretty much reached the end of the road. And that's what needs to be understood. And these people like that need to understand that you're not really going to be working anymore of that line, because it's not going to hold up. And they're not going to continue with this because it's only going to grow bigger, and the people who are standing against Assange are going to essentially be on the wrong side of history here. Now, if you like this post, or video, subscribe, click the notification bell. Make sure to share it all around social media. Make sure that you share it publicly and with your friends. Make sure you check out my Patreon page. Make sure that if you can't donate, make sure you give it to someone else who can. And that's about it. Bye, everyone.